The ICU at Sacred Heart Hospital in San Diego operates on a rhythm that most people never hear. Fluorescent lights hum their constant frequency, a sound like electricity breathing. The ventilators wheeze their mechanical metronome. The heart monitors beep their steady pulse check. But Katie Rodriguez moves through this symphony without adding a single note. It's 11:47 on a Tuesday night. Her shift started at 11, and she's already cleared the supply closet, restocked the crash cart, verified medication counts, and positioned herself at the far end of the unit where the observation windows give her sight lines to all four ICU bays. She moves like someone who has already cleared every corner of this room, every hallway, every entrance. She moves like someone who checks exits before sitting down. Nobody notices. This is the point. Her scrubs are navy blue, the color of invisibility in a hospital. Her name badge reads K. Rodriguez, RN. The K is intentional. Nobody uses her first name. The other nurses call her the new night nurse even though she's been here 8 months. They notice she doesn't laugh at their jokes. They notice she eats lunch at her desk while reading journal articles about trauma surgery. They notice the way her eyes track the room before she sits, the way her shoulders don't quite relax even in the break room. They notice the scar tissue on her forearms, thin white lines that could be from anything. They notice nothing that matters. Inside her jacket lining, sewn with stitches as precise as field dressing, is a unit patch. Faded from Marjah. The Afghan sun bleached the colors from desert tan to nearly white, and the edges are frayed where it was cut from a uniform that no longer exists. She touches it during bathroom breaks, her fingers finding the exact spot without looking. The ritual takes 3 seconds. She's performed it approximately 750 times since arriving at Sacred Heart. Nobody has ever asked her about it. The night shift at a hospital is a specific kind of lonely. The day nurses have gone home to their families. The administrators have emptied their offices. The visiting families have been asked to leave. What remains is the essential machinery of survival, the machines that breathe, the machines that pump, the machines that monitor the invisible electrical storms inside human chests. And the nurses who tend them. Katie enters room for 12, where Mr. Chen has been sleeping fitfully since his bypass surgery 3 days ago. His vitals are stable. Oxygen saturation 97%. Heart rate 62. Blood pressure 118/71. She adjusts the blanket without touching him, checks the fall line, confirms the medication labels. Her hands move with the kind of precision that comes from having done something 1,000 times. Maybe 3,000 times. Maybe more. She doesn't count anymore. The thing about a quiet person in a hospital is that people project competence onto them. She's not loud. She's not social. Therefore, she must be careful, they assume. Cautious. A rule follower. What they don't see is the difference between someone who follows rules and someone who has operated in environments where the rules were written in blood and survival depended on reading the things nobody was saying out loud. She's back at the nurse's station at 11:59 when Dr. Hargrove approaches, carrying a tablet with the kind of casual possession that comes from someone who has never been told no. He's wearing a tie that costs more than her monthly car payment. His shoes are Italian leather, burnished to a shine that suggests someone else polishes them. His presence makes the air pressure change, but not in the way people usually describe. It's not charisma. It's the weight of someone accustomed to occupying space other people had to squeeze around. Rodriguez, he says, and her name sounds like an accusation in his mouth. You're reviewing the billing codes. She looks up from the chart. Her eyes are steady. Standard audit reconciliation, doctor. Cross-checking procedure codes against actual procedures performed. The ICU nurse verifies what's documented. That's my job. That's everyone's job. Her voice is soft. Not deferential, exactly. Observational. Like she's describing something she's noticed while watching the monitors. Protocol requires 2 sets of eyes on billing documentation for procedures over $1,500. Dr. Hargrove smiles. His teeth are very white. Interesting interpretation of the protocol. She says nothing. The silence has weight. Do you have a background in billing, Rodriguez? He leans against the nurse's station in a way that suggests he owns it. His posture is relaxed. Predatory the way predators are when they know they're the largest thing in the room. No, sir. Then I'm not sure your interpretation of the documentation is particularly valuable. He takes the tablet from her hands without asking. His fingers brush hers, and she doesn't pull away. She simply lets go, the way someone lets go of something that was never theirs to hold. I think we'll defer to the people who actually understand how billing systems work. He walks away. She watches him go, her expression unchanged. Her jaw doesn't clench. Her breathing doesn't shift. Her hands don't tremble, not yet. The tremor is something she saves for when she's alone. When she's alone, the tremor comes like clockwork, like her body is a radio receiver picking up signals from frequencies the rest of the world doesn't acknowledge. The chart on her screen shows a procedure code for a bilateral femoral artery exploration that never happened. The patient never went to the OR. The femoral arteries were never explored. But the code exists on the billing report, and it exists at a rate of $23,000. She doesn't need a background in billing to read this. She just needs eyes. She returns to work. The night shift requires constant vigilance. At 12:34 a.m., Mr. Chen's oxygen saturation dips to 92%. She's at his bedside in 7 seconds, increasing the oxygen flow, confirming the mask seal, checking the ventilator settings. His lungs are heavy from surgery, fluid accumulating in the alveoli like dawn mist in a valley. By 1:02 a.m., he's back to 97%. The crisis passes the way most crises do, not with a bang, but with steady hands and the knowledge of what to do when things go wrong. At 2:22 a.m., the ER calls up. A patient arriving from Balboa Park. Collapsed lung. Tension pneumothorax. ETA for minutes. The admitting physician is 23 minutes away, caught in traffic on I-5, something about a diesel spill blocking lanes. The ER is slammed. Possible knife wound in trauma 3. Possible overdose in trauma 2. The pneumothorax patient is coming to the ICU because there's nowhere else for him to go, and every second counts when air is accumulating in the space between a man's lung and his chest wall, compressing his heart, collapsing his breathing. Katie changes the bed in room for 15, positioning the equipment she'll need. 14-gauge angiocath needle for the decompression. She lays out the sterile field. Antiseptic. Gauze. Tape. Her hands work with a kind of muscle memory that belongs to someone who has assembled medical equipment in worse light, in worse conditions, with worse odds. The military Black Hawk helicopters from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment can deliver you to surgery in 8 minutes or to a field hospital in 30, but the first thing you need is to breathe. The first thing is always the airway. The first thing is keeping a man's heart pumping when his lung is collapsing. She's at the window when the ambulance pulls up. The paramedics are moving fast, the kind of fast that means they know what they're carrying. The doors open and they wheel him in, a man in his 70s, grey beard, calloused hands even from 20 feet away, and the kind of bearing that doesn't come from being 70. It comes from being 70 after a lifetime of carrying things nobody should have to carry. His name is Marcus Webb, according to the paramedic report. He was at the park with his daughter. He told her his chest hurt, and she called 911. By the time they got him into the ambulance, his oxygen saturation was 84% and dropping. Katie meets them at the ICU entrance. The paramedic gives her the report in 12 seconds flat. 68 years old. Spontaneous pneumothorax, no trauma. Breathing shallow. O2 sat critically low. Presenting pain right side, mid-axillary line, consistent with tension. She doesn't wait for Dr. Hargrove. She doesn't wait for the admitting physician. She moves into the room like someone who knows exactly what needs to happen and has known it for longer than she's been standing in this hospital under fluorescent lights. Mr. Webb, I'm Katie Rodriguez, I'm an RN here at Sacred Heart. Her voice is calm. Steady. The kind of calm that comes from having given that introduction before, in circumstances where the person listening couldn't afford your uncertainty. You're having trouble breathing. I'm going to help with that. He nods. His breathing is labored. 32 breaths per minute. Way too fast. She positions him supine, antiseptic ready. This is going to feel sharp for about 2 seconds. Then you're going to feel like you can breathe again. She doesn't ask permission. She has the needle at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, before the thought even finishes crossing her mind. Her hand finds the spot like she's done this 1,000 times. Maybe 3,000 times. The needle pushes through skin, muscle, and then the hiss of air escaping. It's unmistakable. The sound of pressure releasing. The sound of life resuming. His whole body relaxes. His shoulders drop. His breathing slows. 50 seconds later, his oxygen saturation is rising. 89. 92. 95. His hand shoots out and he grabs her wrist while she's still holding the needle, his grip strong despite his age, despite his fear. You were downrange, he whispers. It's not a question. It's a recognition. It's someone who has stood exactly where she's standing, who has felt the weight of another person's life depending on their hands being steady, who knows the difference between someone who has read about this procedure and someone who has performed it in a Black Hawk at 3,000 meters altitude with an aircraft door open to wind and chaos. She meets his eyes. Her expression doesn't change. Pressure wound. Stay still. She tapes the needle in place. She confirms the oxygen saturation. 97%. The ER nurse arrives with the portable chest X-ray, and the images confirm what they already know. The lung is re-inflating. The tension is releasing. The crisis is becoming history. But that wasn't the moment that would change everything. That moment was still waiting in the parking lot, still waiting in the form of bullets and shrapnel and a man standing across the hospital lobby with a vendetta written in blood and gunpowder. What that hadn't known, what Mr. Marcus Webb hadn't known, is that he'd just been saved by someone who didn't exist anymore. Someone who left that name, that rank, that life in a compound in Marjah 8 years ago and never intended to pick it up again. Dr. Hargrove entered room 342 like a conductor taking the stage, his Italian loafers clicking against the linoleum with deliberate precision. Katie was adjusting the fore on Mrs. Eleanor Chen, an 84-year-old woman recovering from a fractured hip, when he positioned himself directly in front of the 3 adult children clustered by the bed. His voice carried the exact tone of a man performing disappointment for an audience. "Nurse Rodriguez," he announced loudly, ensuring every syllable reached the hallway, "perhaps you can explain to the Chen family why their mother received her pain medication 17 minutes late last night." The room went dead silent. Katie's hands didn't pause. She finished securing the fore line with the same methodical precision that had once meant the difference between life and death in a combat hospital. Her chart was meticulous. The medication administration record showed 2:43 a.m., precisely on schedule. She took one measured breath and turned to face him, her voice level and professional. "My documentation shows 2:43 a.m., Doctor. Precisely on schedule. Would you like to review it together?" The offer was perfectly courteous. The challenge was unmistakable. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected pushback. His eyes flicked to Mrs. Chen's eldest daughter, who was watching the exchange with the fierce protective instinct of a woman who'd spent the last 3 days scrutinizing every detail of her mother's care. He laughed then, a condescending sound that hung in the air like cigarette smoke. "Our little night nurse and her stories. The family deserves competence, not excuses from someone who can't handle basic protocols." He turned away before Katie could respond, addressing Mrs. Chen as if Katie had ceased to exist. "Don't worry. We'll ensure you receive proper care going forward." The daughter's face hardened. Trust, once fractured, doesn't mend cleanly. Katie felt a single tear escape before she could stop it. She didn't tremble. She didn't flinch. She simply wiped the tear away with the back of her hand, held Hargrove's gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and responded with devastating calm. "I stand by my documentation, Doctor." That was all. No emotion. No explanation. No apology that hadn't been earned. But that single tear, that small, involuntary betrayal of composure, was what Hargrove had been searching for. Evidence that she could be broken. That underneath the quiet efficiency was something fragile. He was wrong about what that tear meant, but he would never know it. 2 days later, Katie entered the break room with her lunch, turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee. The room had 12 people scattered across 3 tables and 4 chairs. Conversations died like engines cutting out. Dr. Chen stood abruptly, mumbling something about needing to check labs on the 3rd floor. Nurse Williams followed immediately. Then 2 resident physicians. Then a medical student who'd never even spoken to Katie before. Within 90 seconds, the room had emptied except for Katie and a housekeeper who was pretending to organize the supply closet. She sat at a table for 8, occupying a single chair at the far end, and opened her sandwich. The only sound was her own breathing. This was how Hargrove worked. He didn't need to issue orders. He'd already done it through whispered conversations and strategic positioning. Don't be seen with her. Don't support her. Don't sit with her. The message was clear: Katie Rodriguez was contagious. Proximity to her could damage your career. She ate half the sandwich and threw the rest away, her hand steady as a surgical laser even though something cold was forming in her chest, not fear, but a different kind of recognition. She'd seen this before. Not in civilian hospitals. In deployed FOBs where someone had done something the command didn't like, and suddenly that person existed in a space everyone could see but nobody would acknowledge. The next Monday morning, Katie arrived at 6:41 a.m. for her shift. The unit bulletin board was where all staff reviewed daily notices, staffing changes, new protocols, infection control updates. Posted prominently in the center, where it couldn't possibly be missed, was a disciplinary write-up. Her name. Her shift. Her offense. N. Rodriguez, failure to follow established medication protocols. Failure to communicate effectively with attending physicians. Corrective action required. The handwriting was Hargrove's. The signature was the hospital's HR director. The humiliation was deliberate and public. Katie read it once. Her hands didn't shake. She absorbed the fabrication with the same composure she'd learned in a trauma bay in Sanjin Valley where panic killed faster than shrapnel. She'd read courtroom testimony from lawyers defending her in that valley. She'd seen court-martial allegations that were just as false. This was small by comparison. This was civilian. This was manageable. But it was also the first visible blow, the moment her suspension transformed from whispered rumor into documented fact. Dr. Hargrove watched from his office doorway, already holding his phone. He'd activated his network that morning. Board member Paulson was on the call by 9:15 a.m., listening to carefully worded concerns. "I've noticed some concerning behavior patterns, sir. Inconsistency in her work. Tendency to challenge physician authority. I'm worried about the liability implications." None of it was untrue. All of it was constructed to suggest something darker than a nurse who'd noticed fraudulent billing codes. He'd also contacted Sacred Heart's director of nursing at her previous hospital in Seattle, a casual call, just checking references, nothing urgent, but did she ever notice anything unusual about Nurse Rodriguez's judgment? Was she always so defensive with supervisors? The campaign didn't feel like an attack. It felt like he was simply asking questions, expressing concern, being thorough. By week's end, Katie received a message to report to HR at the end of her shift. The director, a woman named Patricia Morrison who wouldn't meet Katie's eyes, sat behind a desk covered with the write-up and what appeared to be several printed emails. "You're being suspended pending investigation into multiple credibility issues," she said, her voice careful and rehearsed. "We need to review the allegations more thoroughly. You'll be contacted about the timeline." Katie sat in the chair across from her, her posture perfect, her breathing controlled. One measured breath. Then another. She'd survived worse, had made decisions in worse circumstances, but this felt different. This felt like the life she'd deliberately constructed to escape the things she'd survived was being dismantled from beneath her. She took one long moment before responding, her voice level and empty of the hurt that was trying to surface. "I stand by my documentation." That was all. No protest. No defense. No begging for reconsideration. Just the words that meant, "I've done nothing wrong, and I know you know it." The simplicity of it seemed to unsettle Patricia more than anger would have. Katie left HR at 3:36 p.m. and didn't return to the hospital. At home, she sat at her kitchen table in the afternoon light, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on nothing. The suspension letter was in her bag. The emails from board members were questions she couldn't answer without destroying the life she'd carefully rebuilt. She'd left the Navy because she couldn't be around violence anymore, because the PTSD from Marjah had made her a danger to herself and others in a combat environment. She'd chosen nursing because it meant she could help people heal without the trauma that had nearly consumed her. She'd chosen anonymity because she thought if nobody knew who she'd been, she could finally stop being her. And now, less than 3 weeks after arriving at Sacred Heart, Hargrove had methodically ensured that her employment was destroyed based on lies she couldn't prove false without revealing the truth he was terrified of. 3 hours later, Katie forced herself to drive back to Sacred Heart. She'd gone through the motions of a normal day, made tea, folded laundry, checked on her daughter Emma's class schedule. But by late afternoon, she knew what she had to do. She needed her personal items from her locker. She needed her badge returned. She needed to face the hospital one more time before the humiliation of her suspension fully crystallized into something permanent. The parking lot was half empty, only the evening shift cars scattered across the asphalt. The September sun was dropping fast, painting the sky the color of old copper. She parked and walked toward the main entrance with a cardboard box under her arm. That was when she heard the shouting. It came from inside the lobby, not the confused noise of normal hospital chaos, but the raw sound of violence. Multiple voices. A woman screaming. Katie's body recognized it before her mind could process the words. That sound meant threat. That sound meant immediate danger. That sound was gunfire. She saw the muzzle flash from a car window in the parking lot before she heard the shots clearly. 2 rounds punched through the automatic doors of the ER entrance. Glass exploded inward like ice breaking on a frozen lake. The sound was sharp and precise, nothing like the heavy chaos of the shots she'd heard in Marjah, but her body remembered anyway. Her hands remembered. Her instincts remembered. In the lobby, in a wheelchair by the entrance, was Marcus Webb. The veteran from yesterday. The man whose tension pneumothorax she'd diagnosed with nothing but her hands and her experience. The man who'd grabbed her wrist during the needle decompression and whispered, "You were downrange," because he recognized a skill that only came from keeping people alive while someone tried to kill you. He was directly in the shooter's line. Katie didn't think. Thinking took time. Her body moved first, the same way it had moved in Marjah when RPGs impacted the perimeter and everyone had to choose between shelter and someone who was exposed. She ran toward Webb instead of away from him. Her cardboard box fell and scattered papers across the tile. Her badge hit the floor and skidded into the glass. She had maybe 2 seconds before the third shot. She put her body between Webb and the muzzle. The third shot came faster than she expected. The window imploded, a violent bloom of safety glass, and something white-hot tore across her right shoulder. Shrapnel. Sharp and burning. Her ribs followed, the sensation of being sliced. The impact spun her forward. She went down hard, her left knee striking tile, her right shoulder screaming. Blood was already spreading across her scrubs, not the bright arterial red of a femoral bleed, but darker, spreading slower, which meant she still had time. She'd been hit. She was injured. She was also still breathing. Through the pain is information, pain is data, she reached toward Webb's wheelchair. Her right arm wasn't responding properly, but her left hand was steady. She found his femoral artery location and pressed down hard, her fingers finding the exact spot where pressure would hold. Webb's eyes went wide. "Don't move," she said, her voice steady despite the fire in her ribcage. "You're breathing. Control it. I need you to breathe with me." But that wasn't the worst part. Katie sat at her kitchen table that afternoon, staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. The suspension letter lay in front of her, edges already soft from being read a dozen times. Multiple credibility issues. Pending investigation. Effective immediately. The words blurred together in her vision, not because her eyes were wet, she'd trained that response out of herself years ago, but because the reading light from the window above the sink kept shifting as clouds moved across San Diego. Everything she'd built since leaving the Navy. The civilian identity. The quiet nights where nobody asked questions. The careful distance she maintained from every person who worked those corridors alongside her. Gone. Not destroyed gradually. Destroyed in exactly 47 minutes because she'd made the mistake of looking at numbers that weren't supposed to be looked at. She pressed her left palm flat against the table. Steady. Good. The tremor wasn't fear, it was the kind of thing that happened when your body understood a threat your mind hadn't fully processed yet. Her right shoulder ached from standing all night, from the weight of the stethoscope, from the muscle memory of holding trauma shears that hung from her scrub pocket. She reached up and felt the ridge of scar tissue that ran from her collarbone down past her bra line. Marjah. 2009, she'd gotten lucky then too, shrapnel that should have killed her had missed the carotid by 4 millimeters. The kitchen was too quiet. Afternoon light painted the white walls in shades of amber and gray. She could hear the neighbors' wind chimes from 2 houses over, their sound like small bells in a monastery, the kind of peace that comes from not being responsible for keeping anyone alive. She didn't realize she was holding her breath until spots appeared at the edge of her vision. The front door opened before she'd exhaled. Emma. Her daughter, home early from San Diego State, backpack still slung over one shoulder, her face already arranged in the expression of someone who'd just gotten off an early bus and expected to find her mother asleep in preparation for the night shift. The expression changed. Emma had Katie's eyes, that flat gray color that made people underestimate her until she proved them wrong, and those eyes went wide when they landed on her mother sitting fully dressed at the kitchen table at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Mom. Emma dropped her backpack on the kitchen tile. What happened? Are you okay? Katie looked at her daughter. Emma was 20. She'd grown up with a mother who worked nights, who came home smelling like antiseptic and sometimes like other people's blood, who had a way of checking corners before entering rooms that Emma had never questioned. Emma had asked exactly once, when she was 12, why her mother did that. Katie had said it was a habit. Emma had accepted this the way children accept a lot of things they don't understand. I was sent home, Katie said. Her voice sounded normal. That was good. That was training. There's an investigation. Investigation. Emma moved into the kitchen, pulled out a chair. Into what? You're the best nurse they have. You're always, Mom, they suspended you. Katie didn't answer. She watched her daughter process the words, watched Emma's face do the thing that young faces do when they realize their parent is more fragile than they'd imagined. Emma had grown up in the space between ignorance and truth, had never been told explicitly why her mother didn't go to the VA hospital even when it was closer, had never been told about the unit patch sewn into the lining of the leather jacket that hung in the front hallway. Emma knew something was there. She just hadn't known how much. It's going to be fine, Katie said. The lie tasted like metal in her mouth. It's a procedure. Documentation review. For how long? Pending investigation. Emma stared at her. Which means? Which means I don't know yet. Katie's hands were still steady on the table. This was the thing about survival training, you could compartmentalize anything if you'd learned how. I need to go back and collect some things from my locker. Now. In a few hours. Katie paused. When she'd what? Processed? Cried? Fallen apart in a way she hadn't done since 2009? When I'm ready. Emma reached across the table and put her hand on top of her mother's. At 20, Emma's hands were still smooth, unmarked by work or trauma, the hands of someone who hadn't yet learned that the world was designed to break people who weren't careful. Katie looked at the contrast, Emma's pale skin against her own, which had the kind of tan that came from growing up between San Diego summers and the desert mountains of Marjah. Two different lives pressed together on a kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. I'm coming with you, Emma said. No, you. I'm coming with you, Mom. Katie nodded once. Because what was she going to do? Argue? She'd just been fired. She had no authority left at all. 3 hours later, Katie was driving through the Sacred Heart parking lot with Emma silent in the passenger seat, her daughter's jaw tight in a way that reminded Katie of herself. The afternoon had shifted into the golden hour when the sun hit the pavement at an angle that made everything look like it was burning. Katie pulled into a space near the employee entrance and killed the engine. Stay in the car, Katie said. Mom. Stay in the car. Katie unbuckled her seatbelt. Her scrubs were in her locker. Her badge. The small collection of things she'd accumulated over 3 years of working nights at Sacred Heart, a photo of Emma at her college graduation, a thermos her daughter had given her with the words Night Shift Warrior printed on it, her wallet. Her life, compressed into a single locker in a break room where nobody ever stayed long enough to learn anyone's real name. She was pulling the employee door open when the first shot cracked the air like lightning had struck somewhere close enough to smell the ozone. The sound was wrong for San Diego, wrong for 5 p.m. on a Tuesday, wrong for a hospital parking lot where the worst thing that usually happened was someone getting a parking ticket. The second shot followed immediately. Then a third, clustered so tight together they sounded like a single drum beat. Katie froze. The part of her brain that had learned to process threat in a war zone activated with a clarity that was almost relief. This was something she understood. This was not administrative procedures or investigations or the slow erosion of a carefully constructed identity. This was immediate. This was a problem she could solve. The sound came from inside the hospital. From somewhere near the main lobby, maybe the ER entrance. Katie's hands moved before her conscious mind caught up. She was back through the door, moving toward the sound instead of away from it, every part of her running on neural pathways that had been burned into muscle memory in a place called Marjah where the worst people you'd ever meet wanted you dead and you had to get them to a level of medical stability before they could be evacuated. The lobby was chaos. Controlled chaos, the kind where people hadn't started screaming yet because their brains were still trying to categorize what was happening. A man in a wheelchair near the information desk, his face pale, his right pant leg already dark with blood. 3 parking attendants had moved behind the security desk. A woman in scrubs stood frozen between the glass doors, her hands up like that would stop bullets. Katie understood the wound before she understood the threat. The wheelchair, special forces. She could see it in the way his shoulders were positioned, the way his hands gripped the armrests. The blood was coming from high on his right thigh, the color and spread indicating femoral artery. He had maybe 4 minutes before the blood loss put him into irreversible shock. Another crack of gunfire, closer this time. A window in the lobby spider-webbed, cracks radiating from a hole no bigger than a dime. Katie moved toward the wheelchair. She wasn't thinking about her suspension. She wasn't thinking about Hargrove or investigations or anything except the fact that this man, this soldier, was bleeding out in the lobby of a hospital where she'd spent 3 years learning to be invisible. The shooter was outside. Still firing. Katie was crossing the lobby when the next round came through not a window but the glass door itself, safety glass designed to crumble into harmless beads rather than shards. Except the bullet had come first, and there was nothing safe about that. The door was collapsing inward when Katie reached the wheelchair, and her body was already moving. She pivoted, got low, used her entire frame as a shield between the wheelchair and the incoming fire. The pain came as impact first. High on her right shoulder, white-hot and specific. Lower on her right rib cage, a burn that felt like someone had drawn a line through her with a soldering iron. Her right arm went numb from the shoulder down, nerve damage immediate and obvious, the pins and needles sensation that meant something important had been interrupted. Glass was still falling, safety beads that bounced off her scrubs with a sound like wind chimes. She went down hard. Her left arm took some of her weight, but mostly she just dropped, driving herself toward the tiles to create even less of a target. Blood was already spreading across her scrubs, a dark bloom against the pale blue that looked wrong, too much color, too fast. Her right arm wouldn't move. That was okay. She didn't need it. The wheelchair's occupant was trying to move toward her. Katie's eyes locked with his and she saw him recognize what she was, not just a nurse, but something that had been trained to do this exact thing. His femoral artery was still bleeding. The bullet had gone clean through the upper thigh, missing the bone, but hitting the vessel and everything the blood fed. "Stay with me," Katie said. Her voice was steady. This was the thing about trauma, it clarified everything. Breathe in 4 counts. Out 4 counts. You know the drill. The man nodded. Katie could see his military training engaging, the part of his brain that could override the panic. He was younger than her, late 20s maybe, but he had the kind of eyes that had been downrange. He understood what survival meant. Katie dragged herself forward using her left arm and her legs, her right side on fire, every movement sending new information about the trajectory and depth of the wound. Her left hand found his thigh, found the bleeding artery, applied pressure with the precision of someone who'd done this in worse conditions than this. The pressure wasn't deep enough. She needed both hands. She didn't have them. Sterile gloves from that crash cart, Katie called toward the frozen staff. Her voice was a command. Needle. 14 gauge. Push it through. Someone moved. A woman in scrubs appeared above her, holding the supplies with trembling hands. Katie didn't have time to reassure her. The veteran's breathing was already getting shallow, not from the blood loss but from the air that had penetrated his chest cavity when the bullet passed through. Tension pneumothorax. His lung was collapsing. She could hear it in the quality of his breathing, could see it in the slight way his jaw was clenching against the pain. Katie's left hand held the pressure on his thigh while her right hand, useless as it was, guided the staff member. Second intercostal space, Katie said. Midclavicular line. Just below the clavicle. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping, the sound of pneumothorax releasing, pressure equalizing, a veteran's lung re-inflating with oxygen that hadn't been there seconds before. His breathing eased immediately. His eyes locked with hers, and she saw something shift in his expression, not just recognition, but the acknowledgement that passes between people who have survived together. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes were steady. He was staring at her across the debris of broken glass and blood and the disintegration of everything she'd spent 3 years building. Reaper, he whispered. The call sign from Marjah. The call sign she'd left behind. The call sign that meant she'd saved 47 people downrange, 47 lives that should have ended in a kill zone but didn't because she knew how to move through chaos and make it mean something. She nodded once. That was when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the lobby, his face red, security personnel flanking him like they were here to protect him from contamination. He saw Katie on the tile floor, saw her blood spreading, saw the veteran stabilizing under her hands, and his expression shifted into something like triumph. Get her out of here, Hargrove said. She's suspended. She's not authorized to provide care on these premises. This is a liability issue. The security officers hesitated. Katie looked up at them from the floor, her left hand still maintaining pressure on the femoral artery, her right side screaming with a pain that had finally registered as real. She didn't speak. She didn't argue. She just looked at them and let them make the choice. They made it in about 3 seconds. The security officer helped her up, supporting her weight even though his training was probably telling him not to, and paramedics were suddenly there with a stretcher that they placed behind the veteran instead of beside him. Hargrove was watching from the lobby entrance, his arms crossed, his presence like something toxic that the air itself wanted to reject. The paramedics treated Katie in the parking lot like she was a patient who'd wandered in from the street. Which she supposed. Technically, she was a suspended employee with no authority, no standing, no right to be anywhere near this hospital. They stabilized her shoulder, bandaged the rib cage wound, gotten 4-line in her left arm because her right arm was not responding to any of the neurological tests they ran. Emma was screaming her name from somewhere, but Katie couldn't see her. She could only see the veteran being loaded into the ambulance bay, could only watch as he gripped the rail of his gurney, could only meet his eyes one more time as the doors closed and the ambulance pulled away from Sacred Heart, heading toward the trauma center at Scripps, where someone who still had clearance could continue what Katie had started. The ambulance lights painted the parking lot red. Katie lay on her stretcher, her blood already drying into the pattern of what had happened, and she understood something with perfect clarity. Dr. Hargrove had destroyed her career to protect his fraud. But this man, this veteran, he'd recognized her anyway. He knew what she was. He knew what she'd done. And nobody, not even Hargrove, could take that away. The paramedic was asking her questions about allergies, about when she'd last eaten, about whether she had anyone they should call. Katie gave him Emma's name. She closed her eyes and listened to the sirens converging on Sacred Heart from every direction, and she waited to see what happened next. The sirens converged from every direction, wailing across San Diego like a chorus of warnings that had come exactly 4 minutes too late. Katie kept her eyes closed in the ambulance bay, listening to the radio chatter crackle above her, dispatch confirming multiple units en route, police securing the parking lot perimeter, the controlled chaos of a hospital bracing for an active shooter aftermath. Her left hand maintained pressure on Webb's femoral bleed with a kind of mechanical precision that only came from having done this before, in places where the sand was red and the sky burned. Her right arm hung useless at her side, nerve damage from a piece of window frame that had caught her between shoulder and ribs, and the pain was information. It told her the bone was intact, the bleeding was contained, and she was still conscious enough to work. Webb's breathing had steadied. That was the important thing. The tachycardia had come down from 156 to 118 beats per minute. His skin was still cold and clammy, but the panic had drained from his eyes once she'd started talking him through it, once he'd felt the confidence in her touch that only came from someone who had held this exact scene together before. "Stay with me," she whispered, and it wasn't instruction, it was muscle memory. "You're a senior staff sergeant. You've been through worse. Remember your breathing. In through your nose. Out through your mouth. That's it." The paramedics had arrived within 2 minutes, a team of 3 moving with the fluid precision of people who had trained well. Katie hadn't released pressure until they had the tourniquet applied and confirmed the bleed was contained, and even then she'd done it with the kind of slow deliberateness that came from having seen too many salvageable patients bleed out because someone had moved too fast and panic had filled the space. One of the paramedics, a woman named Torres with silver threading through her dark hair, had looked at Katie's wounds and said, "You need to lie down." Katie had shaken her head. "He needs to go first. Trauma center. Check his pupils. Possible internal bleeding in the left lower quadrant." Torres had hesitated, then nodded, because she'd heard the authority in Katie's voice and recognized it immediately. The stretcher wheel squeaked against the tile as they loaded Webb into the first ambulance. He'd gripped Katie's wrist hard enough to leave marks, his eyes locking onto hers with the kind of intensity that only came from shared understanding. His voice was barely a whisper, but the single word he spoke carried the weight of recognition that neither of them could afford to acknowledge in front of witnesses. "Reaper." Katie had closed her eyes. That name belonged to someone else. That name belonged to someone who was supposed to be dead, or at least so thoroughly buried in the dust of Marjah that she would never surface again. But Webb had seen the way she'd moved, the way her hands had known exactly where to apply pressure, the way her voice had cut through his panic like a surgical laser. He'd recognized her not from any photograph or official record, but from the specific efficiency that only came from someone who had extracted bleeding Marines from kill zones while Taliban rounds had stitched patterns across the compound walls. There were only 47 people alive who had survived that platoon, and he'd just identified one of them. Torres helped Katie onto a second stretcher. The movement sent a shock of pain across her right side that made her breath catch, and she swallowed hard, refusing to let it show on her face. The paramedic with the grey temples, his name tag read Chavez, was already establishing and foring Katie's left arm, the needle sliding in with professional smoothness while the other paramedic, a younger man with a nervous energy about him, was cutting away her scrubs to assess the shrapnel wounds. Glass and window frame had caught her in a pattern that looked almost artistic in its chaos, a scatter of wounds across her shoulder and down her ribs, each one bleeding steadily but none of them catastrophic. The training kicked in automatically. No arterial spray meant the major vessels were intact. No difficulty breathing meant the lungs were clear. Shock would be the primary threat, and infection would be the secondary one, but right now, this second, she was salvageable. "What's your name?" Chavez asked, starting the blood work protocol. "Rodriguez." "Katie." She kept her voice level. "Just a nurse. Just someone who happened to know too much about hemorrhage control." "You're a nurse?" "ICU. Night shift at Sacred Heart." The words came out practiced, rehearsed. The cover she'd worn for 2 years, hiding under fluorescent lights and double shifts, letting the world assume she was just competent. Just dedicated. Just the quiet woman who never made mistakes. Chavez was looking at her wounds with a kind of assessment that came from decades in the field. "You probably saved that veteran's life. Pressure point, femoral bleed, you knew exactly where." He was fishing, trying to understand how a hospital nurse had reacted with that kind of precision to a wound that would have sent most people into shock. Katie didn't answer. She stared at the ambulance ceiling and listened to the siren wail, listened to Webb calling her name from the other vehicle, listened to the world she'd tried so hard to construct come apart in real time. The ambulance bay doors burst open as they pulled away from Sacred Heart, and Katie caught a glimpse of security personnel establishing a perimeter, of Dr. Hargrove standing in the ER entrance with his arms crossed, his face already calculating how to weaponize this situation. He would write his incident report. She could predict it almost exactly. Suspended employee returned to hospital property in violation of explicit restrictions. Created additional liability during active threat. Demonstrated poor judgment and instability. He would frame her heroism as recklessness, her actions as a symptom of her unreliability, a decision to save a life as evidence that she couldn't be trusted with access to patient care. He was already writing the narrative that would cement her destruction. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Webb was going to talk. He was going to tell someone who Reaper really was, what Reaper had done in Marjah, what Reaper's real rank actually was. And once that information started moving through the system, through the military channels that still had her listed as active recall, it would reach people who actually cared about the truth. It would reach people who didn't care about Dr. Hargrove's incident reports or the hospital board's liability concerns. It would reach people whose allegiance ran to flag and rank and the sacred obligation of never leaving someone behind. The ride to Mercy Hospital took 18 minutes. Katie spent those 18 minutes staring at the fall line running into her arm and thinking about the moment she'd chosen to move. The instant between choosing and action had been less than a second. She had seen the muzzle flash, had recognized the trajectory, had assessed in real time that Webb's wheelchair meant he couldn't move fast enough to clear the line of fire. She had moved, and in moving, she had revealed herself, not in the dramatic moment of recognition, but in the prehistoric instinct that military training burned into muscle and bone and nervous system. The instinct to protect. The instinct to save. The instinct that had made her a good soldier and that made her a good nurse and that, in one precise moment, had ended 2 years of invisibility. Emma was waiting when they admitted her to Mercy's ICU, her daughter's face going white the moment she saw the shrapnel wounds, the blood soaking through the trauma dressing. Mom, what happened? Why were you even there?" Emma's voice was climbing toward panic, and Katie reached out with her left hand, the functional one, and gripped her daughter's wrist with enough firmness to get her attention. "I was picking up my things," Katie said quietly. "There was a shooting. Someone needed help. I helped them." She said it as simply as someone might describe getting a cup of coffee, and watched her daughter's confusion deepen. David arrived 2 hours later, having made the drive from Los Angeles in record time, and he sat on the opposite side of Katie's bed with the kind of careful distance that people maintained around wounded animals. He didn't know what to say. How could he? His entire understanding of his mother was a woman who was anxious, careful, controlled, someone who checked corners before sitting down and who kept a suitcase packed under her bed for reasons she'd never explained. He was looking at a woman with military-grade hemorrhage control wounds, with a medical competency that had somehow manifested in a hospital parking lot, with a history that was suddenly visible in the way her eyes moved across the room, cataloging exits and threats and resources. The footsteps started at 8:32 p.m. They echoed through Mercy Hospital's corridors with a rhythm that Katie recognized immediately, the synchronized cadence of military personnel moving in formation. Boots on polished tile, the sound carrying through the ICU like a promise and a reckoning arriving simultaneously. Emma's grip on Katie's left hand tightened. "What is that?" Katie closed her eyes. "Probably your mother's employer," she said quietly, and it was the driest thing she'd said all day, and it was the moment her daughter understood that the woman in the hospital bed wasn't who she'd thought she was, had never been who she'd thought she was, and that everything was about to change in ways that no one was prepared for. 149 operators remained at Sacred Heart. 150 Navy personnel filled the corridors of Mercy Hospital within the next 8 minutes, their presence creating a pressure in the air like the moment before a lightning strike. The commander, a SEAL with the bearing of someone who had made decisions in killing zones, approached Katie's room and came to attention beside her bed. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an entire chain of command behind it. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez," he said. "Welcome home." Dr. Hargrove materialized in the parking lot like smoke finding a crack. His shoes clicked against wet asphalt as paramedics wheeled Katie toward the ambulance, her left shoulder a map of shrapnel wounds, her ribs wrapped in gauze that was already seeping red. He didn't run. He walked with the precision of a man who'd spent 30 years believing his title was a force field, and that force fields don't bend for blood. "Stop," he said. Not a request. A command spoken to people trained to recognize authority. The paramedics hesitated. Hargrove stood between them and the vehicle, his eyes on Katie the way a hunter eyes something already pinned. "She's suspended. She has no authorization to be on hospital premises. This constitutes a liability issue." Katie's eyes found his from the gurney. No fear. No anger. Just recognition, the look of someone watching a man make the final mistake of his life, and knowing exactly how it would end. She didn't speak. Pain was information, and right now her body was screaming data she'd learned to read in Marjah: collapsed lung healing, shrapnel lodged but contained, no arterial bleeding. She could walk away from this. But walking away meant letting him. The paramedic, a woman named Torres, 11 years in emergency medicine, stepped forward. "Doctor, she's an active trauma victim. That supersedes employment status." "I'm aware of the protocols, Paramedic Torres. What I'm not aware of is why a suspended employee is receiving preferential treatment on my hospital's property." Hargrove's voice didn't rise. That was the thing about him. He never needed to shout. "Transport her to county. Not our problem anymore." The second paramedic, a man named Chen who'd watched Katie save a patient's life with one functional arm 30 minutes earlier, looked at his partner. A decision happened between them in the space of a breath. County was 14 minutes away. Katie was already pale, and the bleeding underneath the gauze was picking up. But they were standing in a hospital parking lot, and the man telling them to move had spent decades learning how to make himself immovable. Torres called it in. "County General, Bay 4, trauma incoming." The gurney rolled toward the wrong ambulance. Hargrove watched with his hands in his pockets. Satisfaction moved across his face like a cloud passing over water. He'd suspended her. Humiliated her. Prevented her from helping that veteran inside. And now he was sending her away bleeding like an animal, like someone who'd never mattered at all. His medical license hung in the air between them like a weapon he'd already fired. Katie didn't resist. She lay on that gurney with her eyes fixed on the sky, on the sodium lights bleeding through clouds, on the physics of departure. The shrapnel was still in there, fragments of a parking lot shooting, pieces of violence that would live in her tissue for the rest of her life. She thought about Marcus Webb, the veteran she'd shielded. She thought about her daughter finding her at the kitchen table 3 hours ago, tears on a face that hadn't cried in 12 years. She thought about the faded patch sewn into her jacket lining, the one piece of evidence that remained hidden. The ambulance doors were closing when Webb's hand shot through the gap. He was supposed to be inside, supposed to be sedated and stable on the trauma ward. But Special Forces soldiers had a way of moving when the circumstances demanded it, a fluidity that came from having trained their bodies to operate on willpower when the nerves wanted to quit. Webb's hand gripped the gurney rail like a man holding onto the last rope in a collapsing building. His other arm hung in a sling, but his eyes were clear, focused, locked directly on Katie's face. "Reaper," he whispered. Just the word. Just a breath. But that word carried 12 years of operational history, of a reputation that had saved lives in the places where rules went to die. Reaper. The call sign that meant you didn't leave your people behind. The call sign that meant something. The paramedics didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. Webb released the rail, and the doors swung shut with a hiss of hydraulics and finality. The ambulance pulled away into San Diego traffic, its lights cutting through rain that had started falling sometime between the shooting and Hargrove's command. Katie didn't move. She watched the parking lot recede through the back window, watched security lights fade, watched the man in the expensive suit grow smaller until he was nothing but a silhouette, already turning back toward the hospital as if he'd accomplished something. He had no idea what he'd just activated. 5 hours later, to the minute, the first truck rolled into Sacred Heart Circular Drive. Not an ambulance. A military transport with U.S. Marine Corps insignia. Then another. Then a third. Within 18 minutes, 150 Special Forces operators in dress blues and dress greens had filled every hallway on the second floor, stood silently in the lobby with their hands at their sides, moved through the corridors like a tide that couldn't be stopped because no one had the authority to command the ocean. They didn't speak. Didn't raise their voices. Just filled the space with a presence so profound that the hospital's ambient noise, the beeping monitors, the ventilator rhythms, the squeak of shoes on linoleum, seemed to vanish entirely. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain against the windows, a sound like static from a dead channel. Katie's hospital room was on the 3rd floor, ICU. Her son David was sitting in the chair beside her bed, his hand on hers, when a Navy SEAL commander in full dress uniform appeared in the doorway. He wasn't large. The scariest people rarely were. He moved with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, from knowing that nothing ahead of him would ever be worse than what was behind him. His uniform carried no name tape, just a rank insignia that spoke in languages most civilians couldn't read. Senior Chief Rodriguez, the commander said. Not a question. A confirmation. Katie's eyes opened. For the first time since the ambulance left the parking lot, something moved behind her eyes, a recognition, a recalibration. David turned, saw the uniform, saw something pass across his mother's face that he'd never seen before. Commander, Katie replied. Her voice had changed. Lower. Clearer. The voice of someone stepping back into an identity that had been waiting in the wings for 12 years. David stood. His mother's hand released his, and he felt something shift in the room's pressure, as if the air itself was making space for something larger. He looked at the commander, really looked at him, at the bearing that came from having commanded men in places with names that appeared on classified maps. Then his eyes moved to the rank on his mother's uniform, the insignia visible now under the hospital gown, on the collar that had been hidden under a cardiac monitor's lead. He read the shoulders, the collar device, the history written in gold. Senior Chief Petty Officer, he said aloud. The words felt foreign in his mouth, like he was pronouncing a name in a language he'd never studied. But he understood them perfectly. His mother had been a Senior Chief Petty Officer. A Navy SEAL rank. A rank that meant command, that meant authority, that meant she'd held people's lives in her hands and they'd walked away whole. A nurse, not one of the ones who'd avoided Katie's breakroom chair, but one of the new shifts, approached with a file folder in her hands that trembled as if she was carrying something alive. The personnel file. The one that had been sealed, classified, locked in a basement archive until a veteran's recognition and a hospital shooting had pulled it back into the light. She handed it to the commander, and his eyes scanned it the way a man reads a map of territory he's about to defend. Bronze Star, the commander said quietly, reading. David heard it like the first beat of a drum. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Each medal its own sentence. Each one a moment where his mother had bled or moved mountains or both. The commander's voice didn't change, didn't rise, but David felt the weight accumulating like snow on a rooftop. And the Navy Cross for pulling 5 wounded Marines from a kill zone in Marjah while directing air support under sustained fire. Silence. The kind that has texture, that has weight, that sits in a room like a living thing. David understood, in that moment, why his mother checked every corner before sitting down. Why she woke sometimes gasping. Why healing had required anonymity, because recognition meant exposure, and exposure meant the past would find her eventually. The commander set the file on the bedside table, directly in front of where the hospital's administrator and 3 board members had appeared in the doorway, their faces acquiring the color of men watching their world reorganize itself. The commander's voice carried through the open door, into the hallway, where 150 operators in dress uniform were waiting in perfect stillness. Senior Chief Rodriguez is credited with saving 47 lives in combat operations, the commander said. Not angry. Worse than anger, factual. The tone of someone reading a verdict. Her medical innovations are still taught at Fort Sam Houston. She identified fraudulent billing practices at this facility and was retaliated against for it. She prevented a patient from receiving care during an active shooting incident, which constitutes obstruction of medical treatment. Perhaps Dr. Hargrove can explain his reasoning. The words hit like a detonation. Board member Paulson's face went grey. The administrator backed toward the wall as if seeking shelter. And Dr. Hargrove, who'd arrived moments before, drawn by the sight of uniformed personnel filling his hospital, appeared in the hallway behind the board members. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. His skin had acquired a texture like old wax, something that had begun to melt. A security guard appeared beside him. The same guard who'd handed Katie a cardboard box that morning, who'd watched Hargrove's face flush with victory as she walked toward the exit. The guard held out an identical box, empty and waiting. His voice was flat, professional, the tone of someone finally being permitted to do what he'd wanted to do all along. I believe you know the way out, the guard said. Hargrove didn't move at first. He stood in that hallway surrounded by 150 men and women whose jobs involved making difficult decisions under fire, whose presence filled every available space like an answer to a question no one had needed to ask. The fraud, the suspension, the fabricated allegations, the billing codes, it was all unraveling in real time. His attorney would be calling within the hour. The FBI would arrive by evening. The medical board would emergency session his license by midnight. He was looking at federal charges, at surrender agreements, at the collapse of a career built on the premise that title and credentials were armor. But armor only works if you never encounter someone who's actually trained to break through it. The cardboard box seemed to grow heavier as he reached for it. He walked past the operators, past their stillness, their discipline, their complete and utter indifference to his existence. By tomorrow, he would be teaching CPR fundamentals to bored community college students for minimum wage, and that would be the rest of his professional life. No patience. No prestige. No authority except over a room full of people who didn't want to be there. Katie watched him go without expression. Her son's hand had found hers again, and she squeezed it once, a signal that meant, this is what happens when you build your castle on someone else's grave. Subscribe to the channel. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And if you haven't already, turn on notifications so you never miss a story about the quiet warriors among us.